I'm Andy Borkowski from VGS, and this week I had the opportunity to look at some new games that are coming out from Ubisoft, their tentpole franchises right now as we go into the next generation. To talk about that, I am joined by a guest who also had that opportunity, another Toronto media personality, Bobby Pashalids, the managing editor of Console Creatures. He's joining me today to talk about first Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which we had a brief demo of, and then Watch Dogs Legion a little bit afterwards. So Bobby, thank you so much, man. It's nice to connect.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to talk about these games.
So this, we talked a little bit about it before we recorded. This is more your speed, Assassin's Creed, and I think I'm more Watch Dogs, so hopefully you'll be able to lead us here. You're a big fan of Assassin's Creed?
I think I am. I mean, I've been following the series since the start. I mean,
yeah.
I have a soft spot for it. Let's
leave it
like that. We'll just say it's one of my top leading franchises.
I would say, and I think that's the case for a lot of people, especially considering how it's changed and what the game is now versus like Assassin's Creed 1 and 2, which we're going to get into. Before we get into any of that, Bobby and I both believe it's important to mention at the very least and draw your attention to the sexual assaults and sexual harassment allegations that are going throughout all of Ubisoft's infrastructure, a lot of it right here in Canada, the allegations at least. And even if you saw the videos today, there's actually an announcement that they're not going to be addressing it in any of the release stuff. So before you listen to us, before you watch any of that stuff, take a moment out of your day and take a look at those allegations. You'll form your own opinions on it, but make sure you do address it because we do think it is important. So starting right away, this is just a brief overview of what we got to see in the demo. You're dropped right in as, how do you pronounce the main character's name? I've tried it like 3 different ways there, Bobby.
I believe it's Eivor.
Eivor. It's not spelled that way, but that is how you pronounce it. And,
yeah, these Viking names are like unpronounceable to some people. I mean, I had issues. I had to ask the guy, how do you pronounce it? And he was like, it's Eivor.
Eivor and road and all these different, it's not spelled the way that you expect. Anyway, so
not at all.
The demo has you playing as Eivor in East Anglia, which is a very small portion of the full map. You're dropped into an ongoing conflict between the Saxon king, which is the more regional powers there, who wanted to unite this particular region of Britain by marrying a Viking queen. He was, we believe, to be killed at the very beginning, so we're trying to rally some townsfolk to type of fight against this other Viking leader that has taken over the region. In doing that, though, we figure out that, hey, this king, Oswald, he's actually alive, and we go through the major set piece of the demo, which was the raid of Berg Castle to kill or not kill the rebel Viking lord, save the King Oswald, and have a pretty wedding to watch. Immediately when you were dropped into the game, because you are very much just dropped into it, what were some of your first thoughts and feelings of how Assassin's Creed Valhalla felt?
So I'll be honest, I did watch the leak videos.
Okay.
They called to me as soon as I read about them being leaked, and I was turned off. I mean, it was more of the same, it looked like, and I grew tired of Odyssey after spending over 150 hours playing the game. So when they offered us the chance to play Valhalla, I was like, sure. I mean, what's the worst that could happen? I form an opinion and then I don't play it. So yeah, I got dropped in. It's just Eivor, and I think his name's Finir, and they're riding off to Theatford. It's just one of the small villages in East Anglia, and you come across these 2 soldiers that you immediately start fighting. So the systems that they updated the combat, they updated a lot of the mechanics, and my first impression was, wow, it actually feels a lot better than it looks. So immediately, that's one thing that excited me. Eivor's he's a lot more I don't want to say brutal, but he's visceral. Like the way he operates his body, the way he commands in battle, like he's not Bayek, he's not Cassandra, he's a Viking. So they fight dirty.
And there's a lot more of just textuality to the game itself. Like initially, it just seems like there's a lot more going on in every screen that you see, in every moment. The stuff that's on Eivor seems to move and react a little more with a little more fidelity than it did in Odyssey. I felt that Odyssey had a very specific tone that was very Grecian, mythological, bright and sunny. Right. Assassin's Creed Valhalla, right from the beginning, at least in my feelings, is very different. It's not exactly gritty, but it definitely has those London bogs and marshes, and it kind of reminded me of some of the background that we saw in previous Assassin's Creed game. I forget the one off the top of my head, the American Revolutionary period, when we were able to go through that similar setting. So I do feel like it kind of borrows from a very different tone. It doesn't exactly feel or look the same as Odyssey, but in terms of the way it plays, what do you think were some of the differences there?
So compared to Odyssey, that was it felt like an arcadish game. So like you're doing damages, you're throwing out poison attacks, your sword's on fire, and it didn't mesh with me as much as I liked the older games. I thought Unity was probably the peak of combat. I mean, it was hard, but it was fair. And then you got Origins, which reset the entire system. You have Dark Souls inspired hitboxes. You have the parrying that, unlike the older games. And then moving back to Odyssey, it was just it didn't feel like an Assassin's Creed game. Like they abandoned half of the mythology for an open world that it was overstuffed. So when we played Valhalla, it was surprising to say the least. Eivor's just the way he operates, like I was saying before, like he's an interesting fighter. The way he carries himself, the mechanics are a lot more intuitive. There's a lot more detail, which for an Assassin's Creed game, like you're either plus or against. I mean, for me, I like seeing all this new introductions, seeing the way his cape moves, the way his hidden blade operates. Like you can actually see it ejecting now. Overall, I think it's this extra time has been good for the game.
Yeah, but I when I was playing it, for me, it felt almost a little more like The Witcher 3 than it did Odyssey, just in terms of this kind of grand adventure game. It does seem a far cry different, pun intended there, from the previous Assassin's Creed games. Like if you recall, just being able to dance and navigate on rooftops and, you know, slowly investigate the different mysteries that are happening. This Assassin's Creed Valhalla is still very much just a full-fledged adventure game from what we got to experience. Do you feel the same way, or do you think it's still a little bit more like what the games used to be?
I think in my preview, I actually said it's an amalgamation of the old and the new. So you're getting the new mechanics, but it feels like an older Assassin's Creed just because of the fact they're bringing in Jesper Kyd. The Animus loading screens are back. The boats are back. It feels like Assassin's Creed 4, and then I'd say the best of Origins.
That's pretty good. Assassin's Creed 4, absolutely. Like it really, really feels like that, especially the boating mechanics. But I still think it did. Like in my combat experience when I played the game, because we got to play it for several hours, I don't think I used I forgot that even the hidden blade was an option. I was just, raiding and pillaging and trying to find all these little hidden stories. And, for an Assassin's Creed game, I think that is, for some people at least, not a very positive reaction, because the hidden blade is so fundamental to what a lot of people at least believe the Assassin's Creed franchise is all about.
And I actually mentioned that to them. I was like, I'm not a fan of the way they changed the hidden blade to become... I liked using it as a weapon in battle. Like that would make sense to me. So it's good to see that they listened a little bit. I mean, you still can't use it freely, but for assassinations, it's available. It is a one-hit kill, if they were telling me. The only caveat they said is you have to time the quick time event to land within this window. So if you nail it, it's a one-hit kill. I only experienced it once, but unfortunately it didn't work out 100% just because the systems we were playing on were remote, so there was a little bit of latency. but on playing locally, apparently it works without a hitch.
Mm-hmm.
It's fantastic, they're saying.
Well, that's interesting just to see like this is where these new games are going. You know, maybe the old ways of Assassin's Creed can't really necessarily work in this particular climate. Speaking of the old ways, but how much time did you have on the longboats? Did you get to do some exploration with them?
I had about 20 minutes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I didn't even know how to access them until they told me that you have to use it from the quick menu. So you pull out your longhorn, and then any body of water you can drop in your boat. And then on your boat is, of course, your crew. So if you want to go for a raid, all you have to do is call them and then point to the nearest raid location. And the cool thing about what happens is when you land at that location is I expected just Eivor to jump off the boat and go fight this whole crew of soldiers. But instead, the whole crew comes off the boat screaming and shouting, singing Nordic verses, and they all raid together.
Yeah, that was definitely one of the biggest highlights of the game, is to see what a scripted raid was like in one of the set piece battles, and then also just to do them yourselves. Obviously, there's a lot more things going on when you raided Burg Castle, but I went on a couple raids because I wasn't following the main quest at all. I just, turned left and wanted to sing some, sea shanties with the people on my boat. And those raids, like you mentioned, can be incredibly cinematic, and that's something that I think Odyssey really missed. Like, you had a crew, you had their whole thing, but you were very much still the lone assassin. Whenever I went almost anywhere in Valhalla, I felt like I had my crew with me. The battles were very rarely one-on-one. It was always big groups of people. And I don't know about you, but I kind of felt like that was a bit of a sea change from what we saw in the previous games.
Yeah, and that's kind of what turned me off. I mean,
oh really?
Cassandra. Well,
from the other ones, or did you
Valhalla,
like it more?
I loved it. I loved what they were doing in Valhalla, but when we're thinking back to Odyssey, it was like a fantasy of just being this elite Spartan, and you just didn't have to rely on anybody. But in reality, like, no one does that these days. Like, we all rely on each other. So seeing the Vikings operating similar to how we think today, it actually encouraged me to double down on the mechanics and see how far I could take the raid system. Mm-hmm. And it really impressed me. I raided a local church that had this renounced nun, and my Viking crew raided her whole land together, and then they started looting. And apparently, if you try to raid without the crew, you can't open all the doors in the building. Yeah. So there's the cast iron doors that the guy was telling me during my demo, and you can't open them without having those guys help you lift the doors. Mm-hmm. So I think they're doubling down on the right mechanics for Valhalla, but there's still a lot of uncertainties for me that I want to talk about, because we still have 4 months till holiday 2020. Who knows what could happen between now and then?
Yeah, no, and I think we'll go into that a little more. Just we're kind of dancing with the combat here, and I want to keep talking about that because one of the big events of the preview that we got to do was that raid on Burg Castle. I spoke about
that raid.
Yeah,
it was unbelievable. I was so frustrated with it.
Well, that's what I mean. Like, I died half a dozen times and had to get the demoist to put me to a different moment in the game because it does start you right from the beginning. The raid battles that weren't that particular castle, I think, had balancing that worked a lot better. Like, I felt like more of an action hero with my crew fighting another crew, whereas that scripted raid, I kind of felt like it got a little lost in the mesh there, and eventually I'd have 20 enemies around me, not able to really deal with multiple enemies at once. How did you feel like the actual Burg Castle raid went?
So initially I didn't like it.
Yeah.
I died repeatedly, and the thing about the Burg Castle raid is I think they picked the wrong moment to show us, because that's somewhere down past the middle of the game. Mm-hmm. So, like, we're at this point, we're not acclimated to the controls, we're not acclimated to the abilities, we don't know anything about the game when we were doing our demos. Mm-hmm. And during my playthrough, I died about 12 times before I asked the demoist to jump in and show me how it's done properly.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, he actually struggled more than I did. So I actually had to take back control and finish the campaign mission myself. And from what he was telling me, like everyone that played the demo struggled at this raid. It's the most frustrating part of the 3 hours that we had, and it comes as no surprise that the developers are listening to feedback, and the game isn't as
Yeah.
easy as it used to be, right? So like I do like that, but at the same time, the set piece that they gave us is just it wasn't the right one.
Mm-hmm.
But from what I learned, again, after like I asked a lot of questions. There's about 10 different ways you could approach this raid. So like you can storm the front is the one that I tried first, and then he kind of hinted at me that you can shoot your surroundings. So like there's oil barrels that you can hit with your arrows. There's archers that are surrounding every uh, front door, so you shoot them. There's a bunch of barrels you can
Mm-hmm.
climb over and tackle the archers directly. So he gave me about 5 or 6 different ways to approach the same raid, and it wasn't until I thought outside the box instead of just going straight.
Mm-hmm.
I went up and around, and I finally got to the next staging area. And every time you get farther into the raid, you learn a different way to approach it, because the farther you get in, the harder the enemies are getting,
Mm-hmm.
and there's more enemies on screen.
I
don't know about your playthrough,
mm-hmm.
but the second area is when they introduce the berserkers and the slayers. And on top of that, then you have like dogs attacking you,
Mm-hmm.
and then you have oil pouring down on your ram, and everything's on fire. And it was chaotic to say the least. Like the way that they're doing things now, it's just like it's not just a one focus. Like you have to deal with
Yeah.
5 or 6 things at a time now. And in the old games, it was just like it was a parry and counter system. So you would parry or counter, and that was it. And then you could just manage every character one by one. But now they're having all the enemies think together, and they're attacking Eivor, not one at a time, but like 5 or 6.
And that was, again, an interesting look at it, but that was one of the issues I had, that I felt like the enemies were a lot more uniform in their attacking of me than my allies were of them. But there's a really interesting divide here of what you mentioned, because when you're in the game, when you're in that raid, you want to, at least I did, wanted to be in the thick of it as a Viking warrior with your Viking warriors beside you. It's almost a little counterintuitive to be the more secretive assassin, and like you said, go around and, you know, pick off the higher threats that were happening and actually impeding your progress. So I hope that there is maybe some more balancing there to try to find a connection between letting us do the thing that is the most fun, that isn't necessarily the most difficult, because I had to do the same thing. I had to eventually, you know, traverse a completely different way to get to that ending, and then I lost to the boss like 3 times, and then just said, okay, let's just go to the next section, because I couldn't handle it at that point. But like you said, if you're more familiar with the combat system, I think it'll work better. It's a lot to do with making your kind of your boost meters go up, and using those 4 different special abilities. I found like I was relying on that a lot to get through some of the bigger combat encounters, and there's an incredible amount of customizability within that for both your bow and any of the other attack patterns you had. I don't know if you messed around with this, and I'm not familiar if it's in Odyssey, but moving your main weapon hand to be your shield instead of your axe, and then moving those weapons back and forth so that your left triggers and right triggers affected both of those attacks, was incredibly fun and versatile. So eventually you're using your just your shield as a main attack for certain types of for enemies, and I found that was incredibly visceral and new, and added to the complexity and the chaos of that one moment. But it definitely was something that I think needed a lot more time to really understand and experience.
Yeah, I think they needed to build up to that, because it's a new mechanic.
Mm-hmm.
So like in Odyssey, you couldn't do that. But I mean, when I was in the open world, I ended up starting with the shield, and I think it was the axe, and then I picked up a flail.
Yes.
And then you could actually you can dual equip those. So I had a flail in one hand, and I had the axe in the other hand. And then by double tapping, I think it's A, you can switch your hands.
Mm-hmm.
And then it opens up combat in ways I've never seen in an Assassin's Creed game. So you could like do an area area, what is it, area of an effect attack. So you can spin your flail to hit 5 or 6 enemies at one time, and then as they come close, you take your axe and you can just there's dismemberment in this game now. So you can cut off hands, arms,
and pick up the headless bodies and move them too, which was a little bit shocking right away.
you can pick up. I did pick up a weapon and I threw it at somebody.
Yeah. So
you could pick up a shield and then bash their head in with it. So they're doing executions just like the old games. So in Assassin's Creed 3, Connor would fight and then he can do executions at the end, and they brought that back, but it's been updated to fit the new system, and I think it works well. There's still like a lot that like I said, we need to get the game in our hands and explore what they've changed, what they've added, what feels good, because I think they're finally listening to the feedback throughout the last 2 games, and it's only going to go up from here, I believe, from what we've seen.
It is such a challenge, though, to mesh these new systems and making them work and making it feel like you're a Viking, and that also this is a Assassin's Creed game. So from what we saw, I think we're very similar on the same page, that if we were introduced earlier, not having these pacing problems and really learning from the ground up, it probably would have been easier to master, even if they don't change anything, which I think they will actually change a few things there just to make it work. In terms of the world exploration, I think the biggest thing that I saw was that major city. I don't know if you got to see that, but it was, I forget the name of it, but we were able to investigate and see what an actual city was like that's not connected to a main mission. And there was, I think I counted like 25 different little subsets of quest items that you could do, and side quests and collectibles. And I played through all that. I did the Viking rap battles. I did the drinking games. I enjoyed the fidelity of it all, but it did feel a little too gamey for me when you experienced other aspects of it, just because it's all the systems are right there. Like right on the screen, you'll have, here are all your wealth points if you find all the treasure. Here are all of like the hidden mystery points. And then when you actually do them, it's usually pretty simple, of like you find a cat and someone smiles at you, or you find a horse and someone smiles at you. And I was worried about the bloat of that after playing other open world games that I know you're playing right now, that I think fight against that bloat a lot and try to be more streamlined in how they move the player. It's odd to see the world be that gamey in one hand, and then the combat systems try to be, not as complicated, more fluid in that way. So I don't know about you, but what did you think of that?
I agree with you on that. Yeah. So I think the city was called Elmenham. I think that was the wedding city that we had to do at the end of the demo, where you go and celebrate the wedding of Oswald.
There was another one before that too that I was able to explore. I was looking through your footage. I don't know if you got to that one. I didn't get to that one. So I got to the last city at the end of the demo, which was Elmenham, and that's where the wedding that we're trying to save Oswald for that's where his wedding takes place. So I mean, I got to see the drinking games, which is pretty cool. I actually did like the drinking games. I saw a romance option between female Eivor and then one of her Viking friends, and lo and behold, like the conversation is so cheesy. It's very there's a lot of subtlety between like what he says to her and how she reacts. Yeah,
it's typical of what you'd expect an Assassin's Creed game to have for romance options. I also did like a drunken archery competition. I don't know if you did that.
Yeah, all that stuff there. And also the romance thing works on both genders. So we haven't mentioned that until now, which we should. Anytime in the game, and I confirmed this with the demoist, you're able to switch between male and female Eivor and still have the same equipment and everything like that. And I really like that opportunity just to see how the different actors and different moments changed. In the male version of that romance, it's exactly the same, which makes the language, like, I think even extra corny. Them talking about like stiff spears and like their sword arms and stuff, and the innuendo didn't exactly work in that one case because the other person didn't have the right genitalia for like it was kind of funny. But the interesting thing about that was being able to choose the gender that really worked for you, that you liked. I was on the side of female Eivor. I thought was so much more powerful, so much more interesting in her dialogue. Like maybe I'm coming off of Cassandra and Odyssey, but I much preferred playing as her. You a little different.
And I'm the opposite. Yeah. I mean, I came off playing as Cassandra for 150 hours, and then I came to play as male Eivor, and I liked him way more than the female version. And I think it's just the way the lines are delivered. Yeah. I didn't really understand the delivery on her lines. They just felt very honed in. There wasn't much passion. And then once you switch to male Eivor, it's like, okay, this seems like he's actually paying attention to the lines. He's invested in what he's doing.
So funny. Completely disagree. But that's amazing. But that's the good thing. Like, if I was stuck, or you were stuck playing, the first few hours as one gender, and then feeling like, what, this isn't working for me anymore. This character just isn't fleshed out the right way. It would be pretty disappointing to have to start it all over again. I like the fact that you can switch back and forth with ease.
I think that's gonna open up a lot of opportunity for people who want to switch back and forth, because in Odyssey you were locked in for the entire playthrough. The only way you could switch is through the DLC, when they gave you a free character upgrade, so you could switch.
Oh, I didn't even know that. So we mentioned it before, and I wanted to give you a moment to talk about it, because there were things, I think we've been generally positive, kind of, at least for me, a little bit middling in some things. I want to talk about the different choices, but first I want to talk to you about the things that did ultimately disappoint. You mentioned it before, there were some things that you wish were a little bit different. What were those?
So, I mean, I am from the old school. I love the classic Assassin's Creed experience. I like those shorts game. Like, it's a 20-hour game is more than enough to me these days.
Absolutely.
So when they introduced this new open world RPG, I was like, well, I'm not really sure if I want this. It's just, I don't have the time for these games anymore. So that was my number one concern. But after seeing some of the interviews with the devs saying that just because it's a big open world doesn't mean we're gonna fill it with things to do. Like, we're gonna make sure it's worth exploring, but we're not gonna overstuff it with content, because Ubisoft games are known for that. Unity was the worst offender for that. Like, I don't know if you remember seeing the map, but there were so many collectibles on the map that it covered the entire thing. You couldn't actually see what was underneath. That was number one. And then number two is the parkour. I'm still not on board with it. If you ever played Unity, I think they almost nailed the perfect parkour system for the mechanics. You could parkour up, you could parkour down. There was still a level of wall ejecting and just being fluid as you're traveling through the city. And when they moved to this new system with Origins, Odyssey, and now Valhalla, they simplified it. So it's one button press, and then you would run up and down the walls. And it doesn't seem as fun anymore. They took a lot of the guesswork out of the controls, which is a big thing to a player. People want to be in control of what they're doing, right? So taking away the degree of control that we had before is still present in these new games.
Well, it's almost like it's not as important now at all to parkour.
And that's the thing, though. Like, but why isn't it as important?
I think that it was only, at least in my playthrough, the only moments that I felt like I had to do that are when they were almost railroaded in by the story, where they're like, oh, you need to save Finir, who's on the roof, thinking he's gonna fall, or like, oh, the bad guy just happens to be a little bit tall, in a higher place, as opposed to the other games where you were almost like Spider-Man, you never touch the ground, sort of thing. Like, that was the exciting part in a lot of ways, and I feel like we're very, very far from that. So I agree with you, but I don't know how you square that circle, though, because this game seems so different from what the other ones were.
And that's why I think the fact that they're bringing it forward in time to maybe 100 years from Assassin's Creed 1, we're finally seeing more verticality in the cities. We're seeing more of the Assassin's Brotherhood. We're seeing Templars. We're going to start seeing all the elements that we're familiar with in the new system, which is why I think that the idea of bringing it back to ancient Greece, ancient Egypt was a good idea, but it wasn't the right idea.
So you're hoping that these, because of the setting, we may have more opportunity for it to be like the previous game, because from what I played, it didn't really feel too much like it felt more Odyssey than Assassin's Creed 2 and 3. for me.
And I agree with you on that. In that sense, is it's like I said, it's still too early to tell. But I mean, we did see churches, we did see high-rise buildings. Like there were opportunities to climb. It's just the level of control is gone, which is my biggest concern. So like when we only saw a small portion of East Anglia, we still have Norway and the rest of Anglia to explore. So who knows what we could see in the final map, right? There's still a lot of uncertainty in what's going to be available on launch day.
No, yeah, absolutely. So this is just a small sliver of, one sub-region and a few of the quests there. But from what we saw...
These control demos are really hard to gauge.
Really difficult. We only know really difficult.
Yeah. So it's like we only know what they're showing us. Yeah. But as a fan of the series, I think they're going in the right direction. They're finally starting to move forward in time instead of going back, both in the game and as developers. So we'll see. I mean, and my final thing I didn't like was the Ubi jank is what I call it. I don't know if you know what that is, but it's just the way the NPCs behave in the game. Yeah. Some of them just do absurd things. So like I was in a cutscene and one of the NPCs started walking and he climbed on the roof and I was like, okay. And that happens in every Assassin's Creed game. The other thing is in battle, like I'd have a guy just standing there pointing his sword up at something and not move. And then why I'm saying is I'm comparing it to Last of Us Part 2 is when we were spoiled by the AI in those games. They were like very realistic. And coming off that game and then moving into a demo of Valhalla is just like, okay, well, there's clearly a different level of programming here. Like it's like a night and day difference comparing the two games.
Yeah, it is interesting because I had a different experience where I'm coming off of Ghost of Tsushima, which I know you're playing as well, and seeing another open world game and how they deal with movement and combat in that, and then coming into this game, I felt similarly that, I wished for things to be a little bit different. One of the things that I really did love that we haven't talked about yet was the ability to make choices that are directly reflective of your gameplay. So that boss that we talked about, I know you killed him when Oswald the King was telling you not to. I didn't, and then afterward he comes and attacks the wedding procession, and even there you have subsequent choices of whether or not you want to let Oswald deal with this fallen Viking warrior, or if you do it yourself. And the difference between those endings was really interesting because on the one hand, if you allow Oswald to do it himself and he shows mercy, Finir, the person you've been working with this entire time, sees Oswald as like this merciful god king and wants to work with him. If you end up killing Rude the second time, Finir decides to join your crew and he's part of your game going forward. I was talking to the demoist about what that actually means. He didn't want to, give too much more information, but there's absolutely some deep-rooted effects of the different choices that you make. And for a game like this, I really like the idea of making choices that not only affect, how maybe a line in an epilogue goes, but actually affecting what you have. So now Finir's part of your crew. What that means, I don't know, but that addition to the game, I think, is going to give me just hours and hours of fun. And I'm really happy they had that.
Right. And we don't know what that means for Oswald. So, he judges your decision. So I don't know if you remember what he says, but he looks at Eivor and he's like, blood for blood leaves no warmth in the hearts of men. And that's it. He just walks away upset at you. So who knows how that affects his decisions towards you later on, which I think is really exciting because we've never seen this before in these games. Yeah,
Odyssey tried to do it a bit, but that ultimately kind of just meant characters being there or not being there. And I think this is much more complicated.
I think the team that's developing this is the team that pushes the series forward. So Ubisoft Montreal's team has always been the forefront, and they're expanding on system they built 2 years ago. And if they're willing to listen to feedback, this could be really good for players when the game launches. So like your choices will matter this time, and I'm hoping that they actually prove that that's what they want to do with the system.
Absolutely. I'm going to leave it on that because I think that's a nice way to clear it. Thank you again, Bobby from Console Creatures. Check out, you have some previews coming up right now as well, right? That go even more in depth.
Yep. So like I wrote down what I thought, what I didn't like. Just general thoughts about the game, what I think is going to happen, and they're going live right after Ubisoft Forward today.
So right when you're seeing this, and the links will be available in the video below. If you enjoyed what we said about Assassin's Creed Valhalla, please also click below and on the screen to see our thoughts on Watch Dogs Legion, which I actually deeply enjoyed. As a bit of a teaser there, I like it. It really grabbed me. So we're going to be back to talk about that. Thank you again, Bobby.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Andy Borkowski for VGS.